Hello and good afternoon. Very warm welcome to Sigma Risk webinar on combating the financing of terrorism. So I can see a lot of beeping noises. So a lot of delegates joining in. So we should be starting in next few moments. So we will keep admitting the new delegates. So let's kickstart. We have got quite an interesting topic at hand today, and we would like to make the most of it, the time that we have. So let me briefly introduce our panel members. So we have myself, I will be moderating this particular session today. My background, some of you might already know me, and those who don't, I run Sigma Risk out of UK. I'm a senior lecturer in financial crime and compliance at University of Aberdeen as well, and I'm a fellow and faculty member of International Compliance Association, and also I'm an external faculty member for International Chamber of Commerce Academy based out of Singapore. We have our expert panelist, Ross Savage. Ross has an excellent background in combating financial crime and terrorism financing. Ross has been associated previously with the Ministry of Defense, UK, and the Counter-Terrorism Policy Department. And now Ross is our subject matter expert in countering the financial crime and terrorism financing. And last but not least, we have Andrew Clark. Very rich background, a lot of knowledge and experience in the field, in the front ground as well. So Andrew has worked with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime as an expert, and with the Financial Action Task Force as well as a mutual evaluator. A very senior member, a lot of experience. And again, Andrew is a fellow member of International Compliance Association as well. So welcome to our panelists as well as our delegates who have joined so far. So let's kickstart today's session. So what is something that we are quite keen to know is a very topical subject these days, countering the financing of terrorism. And we would like to know you are joining from where. Quite interesting for us to know our delegates and where are you joining from. So there is a QR code right on the screen. So please scan the QR code and let us know where are you joining from. Your country, that is something that we are looking for to see which geographies are you all attending from. Here we go. The screen has started to populate with our home in England. Interesting. UK, Malta, Luxembourg, Latvia, Guernsey, Hong Kong. Ah, that's an interesting one. It must be either the very late night or very early
late.
morning. So that is a commitment. That is a passion. Ah, fantastic. Okay, so we will give maybe another 10 to 15 seconds to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to let us know where are you joining from. So far, it appears that we have a larger audience from Malta. That's really good to know. Okay, we have 45 responses so far. So maybe we will give another 10 seconds or so, and then we will move on to the next slide.
Excuse me.
Okay, thank you very much. That is quite a good mix. That we have presence here from Far East, from UK, from EU, from Africa, from the Channel Islands, even from the Caribbeans as well. So that is quite a good participation and representation
From the Middle East as well.
And from the Middle East. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so brilliant. That's fine. So let's move on to another poll. And this is something that we are another thing that we'd like to know as to what do you think, what word comes to your mind when we say terrorism financing or terrorism. So that will give us a good indication and good talking points, and then we can take into consideration what you think that comes to your mind, and then so our subject matter expert panelists can take it further and we can talk about it today. Fear, violence, ideology, conflict, terror, weapons, terrifying, drugs, war, harm, okay, intimidation, illicit funds, extremism, guns, human
Interesting
trafficking.
concept. Mm.
That is a really interesting mix. Destruction, chaos, killing, intelligence, bad activity,
Illicit funds. Good to see that one.
Yeah.
dictatorships, and terrorists. Well, I can see one thing here is the fear. Fear is something which is kind of right in the middle, and that is kind of a key word we can say that is coming out of our perception about terrorism and violence, of course. Then fear and violence, pretty much extreme and weapons. Okay, right. Maybe we'll give another 10 to 15 seconds. So let's see what other keywords that come across, and then we will move on.
I think it's really useful to set the scene here, and clearly you can see that the delegates are picking up on some of the key aspects of terrorism that probably differentiate it from other forms of crime, because of course we have criminal sort of statutes around the world to tackle a lot of these behaviors, like damaging property, like various crimes that are listed on here, things like drugs, guns, etc. We've got other elements there like violence, death, murder. So there are a lot of crimes featuring in here for terrorism that legislation tackles. But the thing that elevates something from another crime is one of those other words that's featuring just below violence and fear, and that's ideology. And I think I know we're going to move on to some of the other materials, and Amar, you're going to take us around the world to have a look at various sort of components of why jurisdictions perhaps prescribe over another. And for me, it's that ideological component that really causes consternation, at the UN and around the world. One person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, and it is a really complex and emotive subject. And I'm pleased that ideology it features there, because it's very much that component that then elevates something towards an offence of terrorism for governments to then prescribe or not, based on the sentiments in any given jurisdiction. So it's it's always a tricky area to navigate. It's a tricky area to work in terms of spotting and detecting, as well, as we'll discuss in a while.
Thank you, Ross, for putting the perspective. Okay, thank you very much for answering this particular question. It's very, very helpful, and that definitely we will keep in our mind for rest of the session. The keywords that you have actually identified, which you all associate with when we talk about terrorism. So, promise, this is the last one. So what do you think? How do you assess your current knowledge level to be with respect to techniques utilized by terror groups, right, to fund their illicit activities? Again, that is another thing, another area for us to focus and make sure that we tailor the delivery of rest of the session according to different level of knowledge and experience that we may have within the audience here. So I will not take very long here, maybe around 15 to 20 seconds to get as much responses as possible. And then we will move on to the core subject matter for today. So far, majority of the responses we have, they are very much focused on two areas, I would say, average and low to average. So it does kind of give an indication that there is possibly there is a lot of need for such kind of webinars or sessions that we can arrange for the benefit of our audience. So that is certainly something for us to keep an eye as well, and keep arranging similar sessions for the benefit for the compliance community from all over the world. Okay, so that's fine. So we will move on to give us a really good indication, just taken into just top two, I would say, the votes into consideration. That makes it around 2/3 of the total audience, from low to average knowledge. So we will keep it in our mind when we deliver rest of the session, but also we will tailor our responses to make sure that everything is kind of suitable for everyone's existing knowledge and understanding on the subject matter as well. So moving on to a little bit talking about designated terrorist groups, who they are, who is it a local problem? Is it kind of a global problem? Is it kind of very much concentrated to one particular area or geography or continent, etc.? Or just to get a bit of a perspective, I would say. So I've displayed some of the proscribed organizations here, which have been designated by different governments or international bodies. For example, we hear a lot about Al Qaeda, right? So being designated by United Nations and the European Union, but not that doesn't mean these are the only two institutions who have designated them, but just looking at the space, just two examples I can give. So this is coming kind of more of an international level, and the regional body that we have, European Union. So similarly, another example we have, Combat 18 is an organization which has been designated by Canada, Irish National Liberation Army by United Kingdom, Jand al-Sham by Russia, Khalistan Liberation Force by India, World Uyghur Youth Congress by China, Kurdistan Freedom Hawks by US and Australia, Lord's Resistance Army by African Union and the United States, Neo-JMB by Japan, okay, or Tamil Youth Organization by Sri Lanka, or Wagner Group, for example, by France and the UK, or Hezbollah military wing by the European Union. So you can see that is pretty much very global phenomenon. There's almost every country or have some elements probably within their country or the jurisdiction or the region, which are kind of you can say up to no good, right? Where the governments or institution may have to take some actions, try to tackle the risks which might be exposed or associated through these organizations. So Ross or Andrew, would you like to add anything on what we see in front of our screen?
I was going to say, I think this adds a real complexity to global business and to the people working in compliance, which are going to be, I think, majority of people on this call. Starting with Al Qaeda, that's a UN designation, so pretty much everyone agrees that that Al Qaeda are bad, although they still attract some funding. But that makes it more straightforward, I think, if everybody agrees that. Whereas when you get some of these organisations you got here are designated in some countries and not in others, and Ross made the comment earlier, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. You start to get complexities there, I think, with you might be working from based in a jurisdiction that designates, and then you're working in providing services in one that doesn't, or the other way around. And so it means you've got to really sort of understand it. The last one there, Hezbollah military wing. But if you're a global bank that's based in the UK, then the UK that now designates the whole of Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So you're then going to have that as your so you're not going to be able to, if you're an international bank, finance or provide products and services in a European country in relation to an organisation that they don't designate, but the UK does. So it really makes it, I think, complex.
It does, and a really good point. And I would add to that to say that what the slide also does is it demonstrates that ideological component. Because you've got different groups there that represent a different threat. You mentioned Al Qaeda, of course. You know, the re-establishment of the caliphate is the sort of stated aim, and they'll do so by conducting sort of violent, sort of spectacular attacks, around the world. Hence the international sort of designation around it. But then you've got other ideologies. The far right ideologies from Combat 18. You've then got more localized agendas. You know, the former Irish Republican Army, or the Tamil Youth Organization. So you've got all those different ideologies on display there. And I think for those that are newer to the thematic, I would sort of summarize that most people's jurisdictions, according to the Financial Action Task Force, have legislated for terrorism and terrorism finance. It's just whether they choose in a given jurisdiction to designate someone. And most people's legislation is sort of comprised of three main areas when they're making a decision as to whether someone or a group should be designated. And that's the three main components really are around whether someone is, or a group is, looking to perpetrate violence or harm or destruction, serious destruction and damage to property. That's done for a particular or it's targeted at a particular group, i.e. the public, or a section of the public, or the government. And then that third part is really the motivating criteria. So that is for a religious, racial, political, or ideological cause. And that's why you have this divergence around the globe. And to Andy's point, that does cause complexity. If you are an international business, it's very likely you're going to have multiple jurisdictional exposure, and therefore you have to take an awful lot of care of understanding what the terrorism picture looks like across your business areas, across your operating environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Ross. So now I think a couple of things that we've been thinking about as to we should cover in this particular session. I do talk with a lot of participants from the market, quite a lot, and sometimes there is a just general kind of confusion between money laundering and terrorist financing. Okay, so they're kind of sometimes treated kind of one and the same thing. That the kind of But again, this is something that I'm quite keen to hear from subject matter experts here. The key difference is what are between money laundering and terrorist financing, like from different angles, from the background, the impact, the different stages, the funding sources, etc. So we would like to talk a little bit more about difference between money laundering and terrorism financing. So Andy, I will come over to you if you could kind of enlighten us a little bit more about money laundering, and so that we will move on to terrorist financing and the sources and key features as well.
Okay, well, the first point I start with money laundering, and there's the model there is indicating the three-stage model: placement, layer, and integration. The starting point, though, is it has to be the proceeds of crime. Got to be a crime to start with. That varies slightly between some jurisdictions. A lot of jurisdictions, a lot of people on the session today will be from a country that designates every crime to lead to the proceeds of the crime. It's called an all crimes approach. Every crime, no matter what it is. But there's some other countries, and this is something where you need to be aware if you're in one of those countries that designates by way of the list, because there's complexity there. Because if the original crime is not on the list, then the money laundering laws don't cover it. Due to influence from FATF setting the global standards, there's a list of crimes which have to be on that list if you take that approach. The most recent one that was added was tax evasion, because you can imagine without tax evasion on there, then the criminals will focus on those countries because there's no money laundering. But now that needs to be one on the list. So the starting point with money laundering and the difference to terrorist financing, it has to be the proceeds of crime. It could be nothing else. And there's a big debate to be had around this with tax evasion, because tax evasion, if it's criminalised, leads to money laundering. Tax avoidance, a lot of people will find it distasteful, but if it's not criminalised, it doesn't lead to money laundering. So that's the first point I would make when we look at the differences. It has to start with the proceeds of crime. And then there's this model, placement, putting it into the system. used to be really straightforward when a lot of it was cash. This model was devised decades ago. More complex now when a lot of crimes never exist as cash. It might be funds held in an account for a fraud. It might be cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever. It might be diamonds, whatever. But it's very often nowadays not cash. So, that needs to get into the system. That value needs to get in the system. And then there's a layer in which I always call the smoke and mirrors. When we look at come to Ross discussing terrorist financing, the smoke and mirrors is to hide what's happening, to break the link from the beginning to the end. If the money launderer does their job well, you can't get the link. So authorities, police, whoever investigating the original crime can't get through to the person spending the money at the end. And the same as the other way, if you investigate somebody spending the money on their nice house and all the rest of it, the lifestyle, you can't link it back to the original fraud, bank robbery, whatever it was. So that's the smoke and mirrors, which I think when you with the comparison, there's always that need to break a link. And then integration with money laundering, the end of it, it looks like it's clean. It never is. It's always going to be the proceeds of crime. But for all the organisations that people here in the compliance world represent, it looks like it's clean. It's got an explanation behind it. So when we come to terrorist financing, compare those sort of ideas with it and see that some are the same and some are different, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Andy. And I think you kind of used a very interesting word, very hot topic, crypto as well, right? So how do we kind of bring that into this typical model on money laundering, right? So I'll give you an example. So we kind of, one of the issue that we were trying to look into from money laundering perspective. So here comes a particular client who is trying to buy a property, and the proceeds are coming from one of their crypto accounts. So it's so difficult to try and trace it out, because it's sometimes even difficult to identify whether this crypto wallet belong to you. So when we ask some question, okay, so is this your crypto wallet? Yes, but it doesn't have your name in it. Of course, it doesn't have a name on it. It just has a long sequential number. But you give us this particular information that, hey, here's a screenshot of my crypto wallet, and all these cryptocurrency I have in it that belongs to me, which I have kind of invested over the last few years. And now certainly I want to purchase a property with that by converting the crypto into fiat. How do we validate that? How do we validate that it's not some crypto token being transferred to your account or your wallet by a criminal organization just for you to be the front face? So that's one of the challenges when we talk about the typical model of placement, layering, and integration. Here, that kind of layering and integration becoming very difficult these days. So
yeah, what I'm particularly interested in with crypto is proportion. So as an AML professional, I want to know what proportion of crypto is money laundering, or what proportion of money laundering involves crypto, the other way around. And the same with terrorist financing. What proportion of terrorist financing involves crypto, and what proportion of crypto is terrorist financing? Because even if you said that the whole of crypto, everything of crypto, when you put that value on it that exists in 2023 in crypto form, that is a fraction, a really small fraction of the total money laundering. That's even if everything. So which isn't realistic, is it? So I'm interested in proportions, because then you can get an idea and then be better to combat.
And it's a really good comment, Andy, because if we tie it back into the word cloud around words that our audience associated with terrorism, one that sticks out was fear. And what you definitely have in the world of terrorism, but also money laundering and crime reporting, is a popularization of an idea through media reporting. So with terrorism as well, it's the fear, and then it gives you it gives you a perception that is not necessarily in keeping with reality and proportion. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand that there might be a new buzzword or a bit of reporting, and it leads one to believe perhaps that that's tainting everything in that particular area, like crypto, with the same brush. But of course, if you look at reputable organizations like Chainalysis and Elliptic and TRM Labs, they are able to interrogate the blockchain, do a deep dive, and do what you've just identified there, Andy, which is to say, yes, it does take place, but as a proportion, it's minuscule, maybe even in comparison to more traditional methods and forms.
Yeah.
Amar, so you've brought up terrorism financing, so I think I'll tackle that one. And it's interesting that even though we've used a different set of models there with raise, use, move, and store, actually there are some similarities with money laundering, and you could perhaps use placement and layering when we're looking at trying to define a model for terrorism financing. It is the integration bit, though, that starts to fall away. And that's really because with terrorism financing, building on that understanding of what constitutes terrorism, again, the Financial Action Task Force, it encourages all jurisdictions to have legislation to tackle terrorism financing, and it's through their recommendation number 5. And what comes out of that really is that in a jurisdiction, the legislation needs to be agile and comprehensive enough to tackle all of the kinds of activities that might be undertaken by an individual terrorist, a small cell, or a terrorist group. So it's around the activities component that the terrorism financing legislation focuses on. And therefore, the placement, layering, and integration model doesn't really fit the purpose. So we like to use raise, use, move, and store to then reflect the fact that it's around all the kinds of activities, not just the fundraising activities. And there's more on that in a moment, so I'll come back to that, and a differentiator between perhaps money laundering, but how terrorists use it, how they move it, and how they store it. There might be some similarities with mechanisms used. For example, Andy mentioned crypto. Again, yes, terrorism and terrorists use crypto, not perhaps as much as they did 2-3 years ago. There were some significant enforcement actions out of the US, which disrupted millions of sort of dollars worth of crypto linked to a few organizations. But yes, they do. Interestingly, the reporting I've seen of late from TRM Labs suggests that in more recent years, state actors like North Korea and the Lazarus Group and state-backed terrorist organizations and non-state-backed organizations have sort of moved away from Bitcoin use and the blockchain associated with Bitcoin to a blockchain known as Tron, and are much more active on using a cryptocurrency known as Tether, which is a stable coin which is pegged to the US dollar. So again, for our audience, if you've got any exposure to crypto, like having a deep dive on what that actually looks like, the threat, is really important because it changes all the time. Now, one of the key features of TF that you've just brought up on the slide there, Amar, and it is a differentiator from money laundering, and Andy will pick this up in a moment. The key one, of course, and why we have to have the activities through raise, use, move, store as the focus, rather than maybe source of funds and then the placement of funds, which is a focus for obvious reasons with money laundering, is because we're dealing with both legitimate or licit funds and illegal or illegitimate funds. So that's a difficult criteria straight away to deal with, because you can't rely on maybe suspect red flags and markers to give you source of funds or source of wealth sort of red flag indications for someone to look at, because it might not be there. Very much you're going to be dealing perhaps with legitimate funds, as opposed to the money laundering cycle that Andy explained, where you're looking to cut the link between the crime and the ultimate user of the funds. With money laundering, of course, it's all about spending the proceeds. If you're a professional money launderer, you're taking a fee. If you're the original criminal, you want to live a lifestyle off the back of it. Not really so with terrorism finance, because here it's very much around building up towards something, i.e. an attack. So it's that criminal end use, and it's all around the funding of all of the kinds of different activities before that happens, and we'll come back to that later. But I think, Andy, you'll pick up the key features here of money laundering to compare and contrast.
Yeah, with the considering what you said there, and with the money laundering, it's for money, it's for value to be able to spend that value and enjoy the lifestyle with the type of predicate crimes, the type of crimes that I mentioned, which lead to the money laundering, the frauds, the human trafficking, the drug trafficking, all of the counterfeiting, all of those crimes lead to the proceeds, and the criminals can live a nice lifestyle. There are some other issues around control and whatever, but mainly it's to have a nice lifestyle. From the compliance perspective, money laundering is not easy to spot. It's challenging, it's difficult, but spotting terrorist financing from the compliance perspective is on another level, isn't it? Because with money laundering, we're looking at people want the money to have the nice lifestyle, so they're looking at amounts, large amounts. So our controls, our rules on transaction monitoring will be around amounts, and people putting through large amounts, whether that's through businesses or through personal bank accounts. So I'm never going to say that money laundering is easy to spot, but I will say that terrorist financing is on another level, because you can't apply the same rules, the same methods to tackle it as you can with money laundering. Money laundering, you can look at where they're putting money through in large amounts through the bank account, they're investing it in property, they're passing it across the table in a casino. It's amounts, it's value, because that's what they want to churn through and spend on their nice lifestyle.
And interestingly, Andy, you may have a crossover there to terrorism finance, because, of course, as we saw from some of the delegates, there are these crimes, these fundraising mechanisms that feature within the world of terrorism, in terms of those groups looking to profit from criminal behaviour. So yes, it may very much appear to be, suspicions of money laundering, because you're just not going to necessarily have the extra piece of the puzzle to identify that ideological component. And we'll look later on at a real world example of that. So yeah, I think from a compliance perspective, don't worry necessarily about getting bogged down to whether it's this kind of predicate crime, or whether it's this, or whether it's linked to terrorism. If it's suspicious, acknowledge why you feel it's suspicious, and go through your correct reporting procedures internally and then externally. Because certainly with terrorism and terrorism finance, then the FIU, the financial intelligence unit, working with other bits of government, be that law enforcement or the intelligence community, they may have that extra piece of the puzzle, that the information that you then provide, it all joins together, and then they're able to realize what's going on. And it's absolutely vital. And all of the briefings I ever give to the financial sector, it is to say, the work that you do, even though we acknowledge sometimes you don't get the feedback that you should, but every single terrorism finance investigation I've ever been involved with, every counter-terrorism operation has always utilized financial information from the financial sector. So if there's one message to take away from me, it's that don't get disheartened with lack of feedback, which obviously is a real issue for FIUs around the world because of the volume. But don't get disheartened, because it is absolutely invaluable, the information that you provide.
Really good point.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you, Ross and Andrew. I think this is I would say a very key message over here as well. Ross, continuing on your comment, I was actually very recently delivering a training session to one financial institution, and there was this kind of perception that, look, we are a financial institution, we are not a police. We are not the law enforcement, so that is not our responsibility. But the message that I did put across as well, of course, we are not the police, we are not the law enforcement. Our job is not to kind of punish the criminals, right? However, we may have access to some very useful information, because you take any kind of criminal activity, be it money laundering or terrorism financing, bribery, corruption, they all somehow, someone is trying to kind of either make money out of it, or they will need access to the funds to continue whatever they want to do. So now that takes us to very nicely to the next slide of our presentation on the revenue generation. So how does these terrorist organizations fund their activities? It's quite important to understand, especially from a financial institution perspective, that the more we know, the better it is for us. Only then we will be able to identify the key methods, traditional methods, or some of the emerging methods which have been or currently being used by several terrorist organizations. So two different segments, I would say. One is the non-criminal origin. So that is one stream of
Mm.
revenue generation where the source of the revenue or the funding may not be connected to any criminal activity. So I move on to Ross. Would you
Yeah.
like to take it on, elaborate a little bit more about these sources of funding for terrorist organizations, which may not be originally for a criminal origin?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the key message with terrorism finance is this distinguishing feature from money laundering, that at the very outset, some of the funding may be difficult to track because of the fact it wouldn't conform to usual sort of red flag markers around criminal enterprise. I like the fact you've got the red around the green though, because of course the legislation from a terrorism financing perspective means that what we kind of all have to be are, sort of mind readers, be able to see into the future, because it's all around how those funds are used, the intention of the use of those funds, which of course is pretty problematic to actually identify. But be that as it may, the legislation allows for, if there is an intention for legitimate funds to be used in the funding of any kind of terrorism activity, then most of our jurisdictions legislation kicks in and it enables that to be a criminal offence. So you've got the red around it to acknowledge that fact that even though the source may well be legitimate, as soon as it is then used for any kind of terrorist purpose, it then becomes an offence. I mean, starting with charitable donations, it's always one that comes up. I think we can almost split this into two, and I know you'll bring up the criminal origin, and Andy, I'll ask you to pick up on that in a moment. Charitable donations almost fits into both camps, because one of the key takeaways really with charitable donations and terrorism is that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, a registered charity is not aware that their charity is being used for a terrorism sort of fundraising opportunity, and that's really because operations have shown that there's some dynamics that make charities and not-for-profit organizations vulnerable. One, it's because often they are working in or near conflict zones. That offers opportunities for people to actually physically use the charity as cover to move into those regions. Two, it taps into goodwill. So often people don't like to ask too many questions, because if it's a charitable purpose, there's that sort of human nature side to it. Three, you often also find that of the regulated sectors, the charitable sector around the world is the one that comes up the weakest, really. Not every jurisdiction even has a regulated authority that is dedicated to actually look after the charities in its jurisdictions sort of behavior. So all of those reasons mean it's particularly susceptible. Also, you can link it in with crowdfunding, online, and ask for donations from diasporas, wherever they may be, anywhere in the world. So there's lots of reasons why terrorists, as well as criminals, but terrorist groups look to exploit charitable donations. Sometimes, though, there are some maybe complicit trustees, and depending where you are in the world, there are these cases out there where the people running the charity actually do know that they are using that to then divert some, if not all, funds for a terrorist purpose, maybe sending that out to a particular project that on the face of it is around sort of providing academic services to children, but then you see reporting latterly, and then it actually says shows that they're sort of looking at extremist sort of materials and radicalization processes. But most of the time, the charity themselves are unaware. It's more that the individual terrorists or a small cell are raising money on the face of it for that legitimate charity, and then they'll divert some of that for their own cause. So that's definitely an aspect there. Crowdfunding, of course. Actually, we've seen this quite a lot for many terrorist organizations across different ideologies. So I've certainly seen it with so-called sort of radical sort of Islamic organizations like Al-Qaeda and so-called sort of Islamic State or Daesh tapping into crowdfunding. But I've also seen it with far-right groups like Combat 18 and others who actually ask their supporters to donate for members who maybe are facing legal costs. So yeah, crowdfunding, asking for donations. Also, we've of course seen it with Hezbollah and Hamas, where you've got an existing humanitarian crisis, and then others that maybe of the more sort of extremist bent are utilizing genuine humanitarian causes to raise money for a different, more extreme purpose. The legitimate use of commercial enterprises. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a fundraising opportunity where you've got legitimate activity, and all the best money laundering and also terrorism financing schemes have what's known as this commingling of funds, don't they, Andy? Where you've got legitimate trade and illegitimate trade all mixed together, and then straight away you've got that layering, you've got that complexity that is generated. It makes it really hard to spot. Self-funding, when we come on to look at the pyramid, I'll perhaps provide a real-world example of that, because yeah, that's definitely a problem with spotting terrorism financing. And if you work in compliance, you've got people using their own salaries, legitimate credit. It doesn't take an awful lot of money to have enough money to carry out a sort of low value attack. So self-funding, salaries, loans, credit is absolutely something that they tap into.
Thank you, Ross. I'll come to you, Andina, to elaborate a little bit more about the revenue generation streams for terrorist organizations, where the origin of the funds are often criminal origin.
Yeah, well, a difference here, that this is when it's the proceeds of crime that's being used by the terrorist organization, individual or group. What happens, and historically looking at cases, what happens more often than not is that rather than the terrorist involved in the criminality itself, so that could be drug trafficking, human trafficking, counterfeiting is a massive one. So rather than being involved in the actual criminality itself, they in a way charge a levy to the criminals who are carrying out that activity, and that provides them with an income, and that levy can allow them to continue with their criminality unhindered. We saw this in Colombia with FARC. That was a designated terrorist organization. They had a levy on the cocaine producers, and we saw Islamic State doing this. They controlled a lot of territory, so they controlled everything that the criminals got involved with in that territory. So they could charge a levy on, there was human trafficking or people smuggling, both, two different things, but running through their territory. So they would charge a levy to allow them to go through, because they were quite within their ability to prevent it. So they allowed the people to be trafficked and smuggled across the area they controlled, and that gave them an income. So it's the proceeds of crime being used, but it's not always the terrorists that are actually engaged in the actual criminality itself. Some they are actually engaged in, kidnap for ransom being classic one, particularly in Horn of Africa, Somalia, around that area, kidnap for ransom. That tends to be the terrorists involved in that, and we saw that. It's fairly historic now, but with the ships being held for ransom, with tourists being kidnapped and held for ransom as well, that tended to be the actual terrorists that were carrying that out. But a lot of the other side, the cybercrime, ransomware, fraud, I mentioned counterfeiting. Fraud's a big income stream for terrorist organizations. You do see some differences in terrorist organizations. I'm sure, Ross, you see this with the non-criminal origin as well. Some of them tend to have their favorites as to having an income stream. There was, Amar, you mentioned one earlier, the Tamil youth, but with the Tamil Tigers, which was designated, one of their favorite income streams was through fraud, particularly check and credit card fraud in countries in Europe. And then you would find the criminals carrying out the crime itself, the fraud itself, were then using the proceeds and sending them to the Tamil Tigers. Well, the way you could pick up on that, and I used to stress this with police training, was looking at, is there evidence, and it's difficult to get in that idea, we're looking at in each case, but is there evidence of where the money's going that they're making? So if you've got two individuals, I can think of one particular case, two individuals involved in generating tens of thousands of pounds, it was UK, worth of check and credit card fraud, and yet they were living in absolute squalor. Neither of them had a drugs habit or anything like that they had to feed. Where was the money going? And that question was asked in that case, and it turns out that they were, then through some intelligence links, that was the income source for the terrorist organisation. So there's different ways that I'm finishing off on that one there with exploitation of natural resources, stealing natural resources, providing a second export stream which is a criminal controlled and terrorist controlled origin, back to Somalia with the export of charcoal. A lot of countries around the world are importing charcoal from Somalia. Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization, has a lot of control over that and gets an income stream from that. There's almost a legitimate flow of export and a Al-Shabaab controlled flow of export, which again provides them with an income. But that's based on theft of it and fraud. So I'd class that as a criminal origin, not as a legitimate enterprise.
Yeah.
So there are some crossovers there as well.
Absolutely, that's both of you. Thank you really for kind of bringing the key differences from kind of legitimate origin perspective and criminal origin perspective as the sources of funding of terrorism. So now moving on to an interesting topic here now. So how does it all start and where does it lead to? How does it all end? So I'll hand over to you, Ross, to elaborate a little bit more about kind of, what are the key stages? How did kind of, of an act of terrorism, what is involved? And if you can shed a bit light on that, please.
No problem. I mean, this is sort of a pyramid model that helps us visualize the sort of activities and the model that will be occurring in the run up to an attack. So obviously it depends what kind of brand of terrorism, an event that you're dealing with. Terrorism and terrorism financing as a thematic is huge. Obviously, if you're exposed at sort of an organizational level, because perhaps there's a wealthy family office in a particular region of the world, the way that you would be exposed to terrorism finance will look very different from a commercial high street bank, perhaps with an individual that's been self-radicalized. So it really it depends what form of terrorism you're dealing with. This pyramid, though, does a good job at bringing to life that sort of raise, use, move, store model within sort of an environment of visualizing someone or a small cell perhaps embarking upon raising some funds, using those funds in the run up to an attack. Now, what we've got at the bottom are the sort of source of funds. We've already identified it can come from either legitimate or illegitimate means. I mean, one of the ones that we didn't talk about was actually what we did start to see was a shift, an organizational shift from an organization like Al-Qaeda, who prided themselves on their sort of operational security. They only like to recruit people that were referred to as sort of clean skins with no criminal background at all. Actually, Islamic State took a more pragmatic approach, and actually they quite liked individuals that did have a bit of a criminal background because of the ability for them to tap into illegal fundraising opportunities and be able to get hold of weapons and stuff. So you had a shift from from the actual the terrorist organization mindset, even though sometimes they're used interchangeably. But that's the conversation for another day, the difference between Al Qaeda and Islamic State. But I've seen, the abuse of credit cards, low-level fraud, benefit fraud, PPE fraud during COVID, insurance fraud, where people have a crash in a car known to each other and then claim off the insurance, all this kind of low level type criminality. But also, if we use the example of the 7/7 attacks in London, the 7th of July in 2005, actually the lead cell member there actually funded that cell's activities from his own wages. It sort of sends a shiver down my spine every time I think about what he did for a living. He basically worked in a school as a sort of learning support mentor, and pretty much funded that cell's activities from his legitimate wages and legitimate credit. Now, what you have in the middle are that sort of use part of the model, and this is around acknowledging FATF's requirement for legislation to pick up on all the activities. So as an investigator, and if you work in compliance, what you're doing here really is you're looking to identify the activities that you might witness, the financial markers, the activities. Does this make sense? Does it, is it in keeping with the expectations of the client? Are there additional information out there, on social media or adverse media that might give you, something that indicates this person actually is holding extreme views? Maybe there's some transactional markers, which there can be, and something in the masterclasses that you'll talk about later, we can come back to and talk to in more detail. But you can see there, can't you, in the middle, these are all going to leave a financial trace. Unfortunately, with the 7/7 case, it was a post-incident investigation which revealed, well, yes, the cell members did embark on some training. Some of them travelled over and received some training from Al Qaeda Corps. They took part in outward bounds training in a particular region of the UK. They did whitewater rafting, hill walking. There was a lot of online purchases. They bought camping stoves, cooling fans to actually boil the hydrogen peroxide solution down to make it more concentrated. They bought all their materials. All of this left a financial trace. So you've actually got the bulk of the expenditure happening in that middle bit before you even get to the attack. The attack is the last thing to happen, that criminal end use. The 7/7 example, the cost on the day was the tickets, the bus ticket, the underground ticket. All of the expenditure went beforehand in the run up to that. So this model here helps us visualize that.
Put myself on mute. So okay, thank you, Ross, for elaborating on that particular model. So now we are pretty much 5 minutes away from the conclusion. What I would like to wrap up now here is to see and look into a real life case study. Right? So this is a really good example of how different segments of the organized crime syndicates, they come together to help each other. That's what mostly you say, the friend of my the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So we sitting in a financial institution or in law enforcement, so different, all we are trying to achieve is to combat that terrorism financing, money laundering, bribery, and corruption. So all these actors who are involved in those kind of illicit activities, they are collaborating and cooperating with each other to beat us as well. Right? So this is quite important to understand. So this particular case study that was actually published by New York Times back in the days, quite interesting. And I will request Andy and Ross to chip in to elaborate a bit more on different stages of what actually has happened. But I am going to display few key steps which had been undertaken by different segments of the crime world to undertake their activities. So we a lot of us, we are very well aware as to Latin America is hub for the drugs industry, and a lot of the drugs which are actually produced in Latin America end up here in Europe and rest of the world as well. So in this particular case, what was actually happening is quite difficult to literally bring in drugs straight from Latin America to, say, using an aircraft into the UK or rest of the world or Europe somewhere. So there's a lot of check and balances which are in place. So the mechanism which was actually adopted that included a movement of cocaine from Latin America into West Africa, and then internally through different kind of on the road transportation and through some smaller boats, etc. Then them drugs would eventually end up in Europe. And this is where the revenue would be generated. And of course, a drug dealer from Europe is not going to make a bank transfer to the originator in Colombia. So the funds were actually coming back from Europe back into the West Africa. So that is the proceed of crime coming up in West Africa. And then there's another leg. There is a huge demand of used cars in whole of the Africa. Right? So, and then a large shipments of used cars would actually take place from US to West Africa, and those cars would be sold throughout Africa. And then this is, I would say, a legitimate looking activity, but again, they're all members of different syndicates who are actually handling the end-to-end process. And this is the proceed of crime in terms of the funds received from Europe for sale of drugs and the sale of used cars. They will be commingled, and they would be submitted into different exchange houses all over the Africa. And these exchange houses are kind of, in a way, they had a free hand to do and accept anything and everything that comes to them, not a lot of checks and balances. And from these exchange houses, some funds were actually being diverted to Lebanese Canadian Bank, we call them LCB, and some funds were actually diverted to a designated terrorist organization, Hezbollah. So that is a source of funding for one of the terrorist organization, where the funds originating from the sale of drugs and from the sale of cars been commingled and shifted onto one terrorist organization. And then it carried on to some further stages. So of course, this was not a one-off activity, right? So more cars needed to be purchased to carry on the circle. So some of the funds from Lebanese Canadian Bank, for example, they were transferred back to USA to buy more cars and ship it back into Africa and then commingle the proceeds. At the same time, one important piece which is missing, so we have seen the funds going to a terrorist organization and going to the sellers of cars in US, but we haven't seen that particular leg of the funds being made available to the originators in Colombia. So the next stage or the next leg of this particular mechanism was some of the funds from this Lebanese Canadian Bank were actually being transferred to China to purchase some consumer goods, computers, laptops, washing machines, you name it, any kind of electrical and consumer goods. And those goods would be shipped all the way to Latin America. And again, there would be wholesalers, retailers based in Latin America who would sell all of these consumer goods all across the South America, get the revenue, and pay back to the starting point, the cocaine sellers. So here you can see a very good example of an organized crime working together. So we can see, funding of terrorism here. We are seeing an activity of drug dealing here, right? And then legitimate looking legs where used cars and some of the consumer goods are bought and sold as well. So conscious of time, we've got literally a minute left. Ross or Andy, you would like to add something to that particular case?
I could add lots to it, Tamarva. So we're sort of out of time, but yeah, I mean, it demonstrates perhaps from a terrorism point of view why, for those wondering why, why have the United States been so focused on, Hezbollah, this organization in the southern Lebanon? It's because, Hezbollah are active around the world in South America, impacting, on the United States borders. Hezbollah are predominantly funded by Iran. So, there's lots of geopolitics in here as well. The US have had Hezbollah as a proscribed foreign terrorist organization since 1997. And this might, in some small way, indicate, why that is, because of the operations that Hezbollah have had over the globe over the last 20, 30, 40 years.
Thank you, Ross.
The only point I'd add on that, from the AML perspective, I look at this case study and I think, how could it have been stopped? And if you apply AML standards, the exchange houses should have carried out, but exchange houses in most countries, I'd go as far to say, of the world, the money service businesses are not particularly strongly regulated, but the bank is there. An international bank should have viewed the exchange houses as higher risk. They didn't, so the whole AML part of it fell apart, which allowed this to happen and go on for several years. And there were massive amounts of money involved. So from the AML perspective, big fail in there.
Thank you, Andy. And that leads to very nicely concluding this particular session. And again, this is what we always talk about. We can talk about these subjects, these topics, and each of them, a segment of money laundering or terrorism financing or bribery and corruption, all kind of as a separate session in details. But here is a brief snapshot of different bespoke training masterclasses that we have designed, which we actually deliver to our clients all over the world, where we can actually dig deep. We can dedicate quite a lot of time where we can talk about a lot of real life case studies, what went wrong, what happened, what could have happened if we had done A, B, C, or X, Y, and Z. So it will be quite interesting to share with you that different options that are available. If anyone would like to explore, to dig deep or know a bit more about different options available to enhance your knowledge and understanding. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending this session today, and many thanks to Ross and Andy for taking time to take part in today's session. So you all have a really lovely evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.